Hello, everybody. This is Peter Joseph, and welcome to the June 13th TZM Global Radio Show for the Zeitgeist Movement. Hope everyone's doing well out there. Today, I'm going to cover a number of temporal issues, project-wise, that we're doing, and also answer lots of questions, which is pretty much the core focus of this. For those that don't know, I spent the first 2 years of the existence of this radio show answering questions and eventually just got tired of it, as one might imagine, under the general assumption that people would kind of go back and listen to prior radio shows and not ask the same questions over and over again. But since that time, roughly 3, close to 4 years ago, a lot of education has spread quite well, and a lot of the questions that I reviewed in preparation for this show were quite well created and to the point. So I'm actually excited to be able to go through some of these. But before I do, let's go through some recent developments and some project stuff occurring in the movement. I want to point out we've added a Singapore and Taiwan and Hong Kong chapter. We often get locked in, to the world we live in, and we kind of forget how many other cultures there are. I know I tend to find myself centric on the West so much. I even got an email the other day, however, that's from a friend of mine, and she said she was walking down the street in Hong Kong, coincidentally, and saw a Zeitgeist Movement t-shirt. And it just goes to show these seeds are planting. In fact, before I go into the general list of things, the temporal stuff, the projects that we've been doing, I want to actually jump in with a summation of the movement and its goals, because sometimes this stuff gets very confused, and I'm amazed the difference in interpretation that people have with respect to what the actual motivations and the actual goals of the movement are. I've spent an enormous amount of energy in trying to explain things in different ways, along with many other people. But I know firsthand from all the questions that I've received personally the tremendous scale of confusion and interpretation. And it's really dawned on me that the simplicity of what we advocate gets lost in a massive sea of projections and confusion and assumptions. That is not even really the scope upon the criticisms as of yet, which I'm also going to talk about in a moment as well. But what is the Zeitgeist Movement? The Zeitgeist Movement essentially is an organization of people that recognize that we have technical solutions available to us that are not being implemented for the sake of problem solving because of the existing socioeconomic order. I'll state that again. Zeitgeist Movement is a group of people, human beings, sharing the same planet, part of the same family. You can go back to the mitochondrial Adam and Eve. We all come from the same basic DNA construct thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago in Africa. One family, one habitat. Seems rational to me. Too bad you've run into a tremendous wave of noise if you talk that way. Suddenly you're a communist and all the other bullshit that we deal with on a daily basis. But recognizing that empirical, static, scientific reality, not acknowledging the extreme cultural diversity we have out there, that as we migrated to different areas of the planet, we developed certain features that separated us physically. We began to develop cultural elements with drastically different influences in different pockets of the world. Religious ideology began to materialize in a philosophical ideology, back into scientific ideology, which is the only real ideology that we have. And here we are in this massive dichotomous world based on division with all of these solutions, back to my point, technical solutions, that could solve the hunger, solve the wars, solve the general misery and lack of public health we see, the psychological disorders, of course the medical problems ranging in a massive scale of origin, namely back to this monetary market economy. All of that lingo aside and pontification on my side aside, what we have is a group of people that want to create relevant change based upon existing information that is right there at our fingertips that we are not able to access to create this change because of the existing barriers set up by the socioeconomic system at large. That's about it, if you really want to summarize this into a nutshell. Now, when you realize that, then you end up in this long spectrum of debate with respect to culture, people's values, the things that they've been born into, which they hold on to for their identity. And the real barrier with this is not what's technically feasible, it's people's values and challenging them in a strategic way so they're able to see in the way that what is possible can be achieved if we're willing to relinquish some of these, what I would say are outdated value constructs that continue to inhibit and are reinforced by the socioeconomic system. So I hope that's not too bizarre sounding since I went on my own little mini tangents in that line, but that's basically it. It's quite simple. You talk to people and you'll say, well, we can easily feed the planet many times over. And they say, well, yes, that'd be a great idea. We have the technical capability, blah, blah, blah. They agree with you in ethic, in their moral disposition. But once you begin to describe to them what kind of structural changes are required logically to enable, say, the feeding of the billion-plus people starving to death, one person dying every 5 seconds without necessity because of malnutrition. Once you describe the structural changes, then they start to attack you, typically. Then they become fearful because they don't want to relinquish what they've become comfortable with. And that's really where the Zeitgeist Movement comes in. We have to find strategies and projects to get people to see the other side of this and to be willing to harness our technological capability to solve these problems. And invariably, as our logic denotes, you have to have a new socioeconomic order. There are attributes that come into that logic which are very clear about where the problems and the barriers are. The monetary market economy stands out as one of the strongest, and all of the solutions we have out there on the green revolution and all of these things that people continue to talk about, I've been amazed at the TED Talks, for example, over the course of the past 2 years that have picked up on the rhetoric that the Zeitgeist Movement has been talking about for a long time, along with other organizations as well, such as the Venus Project, Buckminster Fuller Institute, but they're picking it up. However, they're not actually addressing the barrier and, in fact, the root of some of the problems that are at hand. They describe what's possible, but they don't tell you how to get there, meaning what has to be overcome. An enormous objection to the movement, since I just touched upon it, is, of course, the transition. I'm not going to go into that right now. But those that are out there, those that are out there that do object to what we speak of because, quote, we don't know how to get there because we can't predict the future, are basically they're making a comparison that essentially says if you're homeless and you need food, you're starving, and there's food somewhere, you need it, but you don't know which direction to go, apparently you shouldn't even try to go any direction because you don't know how to get there. So the common objection and criticism that the transition is something that can't be explained, therefore you have to throw the whole thing out, that's just unfortunate, and that's not an active criticism. That is a thought process that others, if they care about such solutions, would help join in to create this transition. And by definition, if everyone began to share this value system, then boom, the transition's already there, at least when it comes to getting things done. The technicals are the last thing that's important. The cities, the housing structures, the energy concepts, all the infrastructure of society is the last step to worry about because we know what's possible. There's enough data out there and enough trend happening to see where we're going to end up technically, regardless of our socioeconomic system. It's, however, going to be the impediment is always going to be this system and the values that are reinforced and the power structures, unfortunately, that need to perpetuate themselves, the establishment. In fact, the only other thing I would add to everything that I've just stated is the notion of possibility. People, if you want to control people, you limit their possibility. I often give the example, imagine if you lived in the early 20th century without television, without radio before that time, we'll say the late 19th century, and you only had a newspaper. Your entire notion of reality on the external was one newspaper by probably one corporation thrown at your door, and that was it. Maybe a couple magazines you might be able to come across, but mostly the newspaper. It was very easy to control public opinion back then, very easy for people with vested interests who understood this trend of social control to continue to control the masses as they did back, say, in feudalistic times, where the religious propaganda was pushing forward. The literacy rate was so low, of course, in the Middle Ages, so what could people believe? They had to believe what they were told. And if the surrounding environment reinforced that and everyone else believed that, then the general commonplace insanity takes hold and suddenly distortion becomes normality. So with that understood, limiting people's possibility is one of the most powerful things you can do as an established entity. And basically, people today don't realize that they don't have to work for a living in the capacity that they do now. They don't understand that the tradition that they've been born into is an echo of old technological premises and structurally classed orientations of society, which are no different, in fact, than racial biases that have been influential in the shaping society. Only now it's class-generated. People simply don't understand what's possible, therefore they don't expect it. The term central planning, for example, is often shunned quite maliciously by many out there, and they say, well, central planning didn't work. Well, if central planning didn't work, an airplane wouldn't fly. If central planning didn't work, your computer wouldn't work. Central planning is simply symbiotic, synergistic organization of a given system. That's all it is. And we have a choice. We can continue the free market anarchy, which is exactly what it is. We can continue the everyone out for themselves type of mentality with the divisions that are inherent that cause far more suffering and pain than anything else I can think of, along the scope of the dramatic psychological, sociological influence from that core of the socioeconomic system. If you want more explanation on that, please see the TEDx talk I did called The Big Question, because it was all about that. The point here being that central planning is a concept void of any type of historical relationship. Central planning is not a bunch of, quote, technocrats sitting at a round table deciding the fate of the world. That's called capitalism. It's called the G20. It's called the World Trade Organization. And since I've started that tangent, I will immediately shoot down anyone who's out there grinding their teeth thinking to themselves that the G20, the World Trade Organization, all of these, quote, globalist institutions that work explicitly based around the market economy as a position of manipulation, those that claim that those institutions are not representative of capitalism, or they're crony corporatism, as people like Ron Paul like to romantically talk about, I cannot, for the life of me, understand how the line can be drawn when the entire structural psychology of the monetary market economy is based upon seeking monopoly at all costs. And as much as people want to regulate the economic structure, well, at least some do, and then some on the other side want to let it go full force and have everything privatized, which is... I keep struggling to find the proper analogy to describe the circumstance. I wish I could... I have to sit down and figure that out. I want to figure out an analogy. Maybe you guys can help me. An analogy where you have a group of people with a particular coded motivation. It's a code. It's a philosophical code, and it's constantly reinforced. And somehow the expectation is that people will behave differently than the coding that's programmed. It's like we code it, but we expect that the code will work out a different way than the coding on a certain level. I'm sorry, that's terrible, but if you raise people in an environment based on the incentive of the system and then expect there not to be monetary corruption throughout the whole of the entire edifice of industry, medical establishments, cancer institutions, obviously government as we know it, if you actually expect there to be non-corruption as we define it, without monetary influence, if you really expect that, the naivety of what you're considering is beyond comprehension. And I don't mean that as an insult, I mean that as a shock jab, hoping those that find that to be controversial will go back and research what I'm saying. Anyway, I think I've babbled enough. So let's jump into some project stuff that we've been dealing with in the movement. Let's see here. Yeah, looking at my list. Hold on. For those, again, that are just new to the movement and aren't completely put off by the slightly agitated gesture of this particular host, there are about 7 websites that basically describe what the movement does in its different projects in effect. There's, of course, the zeitgeistmovement.com. That's the global site. There's zeitnews.org, an amazing resource for technological development that is of social concern. There's tzmchapters.net, which is a news site that has, for example, a nice map of all of our chapters. We have a forum for coordinators. We have a wealth of resources that are coming through that site, and I really want to thank, if I haven't already, Miguel and Gilbert and others that have done a tremendously good job with this, and along with all the coordinators' input that have have put this forward. TZM chapters should be a wonderful hub, and as I didn't explain earlier, the chapters are where the movement actually exists. I mean, we have a lot of internet stuff happening. We might even consider putting in a new global forum soon. We dropped it when we completely redid our current site, but it's always been on the sidelines to be reinstituted. These all sorts of things like that that are happening, but the chapters are very critical. So please go and research chapters in your area, or start one if you identify with this direction. But continuing with the website list, we have our main blog. It's just blog.thezeitgeistmovement.com. Amazing contributions there. I always enjoy reading what people put. It's a big scale of education. We have simple things that people contribute. Then we'll have some very advanced stuff. There's the zeitgeistmediaproject.com, which is it's a toolkit of sorts where people can upload their imagery and their videos and whatever artistic and communicative work they've done to try and communicate these ideas. A very large scope. A lot of people use the site to find things for banners and posters that they might print out for one of their events and the like. If you do video projects, this is a great place to post your work. We have the ZeitgeistMediaFestival.org. This is the hub for the Zeitgeist Media Festival that we do annually. We're on our second Zeitgeist Media Festival, and I'll talk about that in a second. Then there's zDayGlobal.org. zDayGlobal.org, that is the hub for our annual Zeitgeist Day, which is another great site, and every year that site gets populated with everything that we're doing. And there's also archives on that site if anyone wants to go back and look at the prior 3 to 4 Z-Days that we have, which I believe have been updated and archived. There's also some other auxiliary sites. There's the TZM Network, which is a social site. We also have our Facebook, and there's also projects that come in and out. Currently, a phenomenal project started by Cliff and the Vancouver team in Canada. It's called the One Planet Project. OnePlanetProject.net. OnePlanetProject.net. That's an active project for all chapters right now. Please go to OnePlanetProject.net and check it out if you haven't already, because everyone's been doing really, really good with that. And now, jumping into the Zeitgeist Movement's Zeitgeist Media Festival. The Zeitgeist Media Festival has a main event and also has mirrored sympathetic events. As Cliff pointed out in the prior radio show, it's very important people ground themselves as far as expectation. The thing we do, and the main event is always very large. We have notable performers. It's a rather expensive and many hour-long event. This year in Los Angeles and Hollywood, we have a 6-hour event at a place called Bardot. Wonderful venue, great location, excellent in that area. If you're in Southern California and you want to come, please, the tickets are available now. It's a break-even event. I'm sure I'll lose money on it again. I always do because the production costs always overrun. But that's okay. It's always super healthy, and it should be a wonderful group of people. I'm trying to be able to perform, but I have to have surgery on my arm, unfortunately. So I probably won't be able to do it. Also, for those that have been waiting for the outputs from the prior year's event that we did at the Music Box, 8-hour event with amazing performances. We had a 4-camera shoot, and no one's had time to output these videos, but they're slowly coming. So that will all be posted actually relatively soon as an aside. But the Zeitgeist Media Festival, it doesn't have to be some enormous thing. The group solidarity, the global solidarity, is one of the most important things for these annual events that we do, and the town halls as well. What it means is that it shows the world that we're working together on a particular level in gesture to communicate relevant social ideas. And if you have a small group of people and you have an outdoor area and you have artistic inclinations, or you know people that have such inclinations and they want to join you, then have a Zeitgeist Media Festival in your area. Don't be fearful of it being small. This isn't about a huge pressed event. This is about showing solidarity and creating awareness in your region to whatever effect you can. So there's no ego with this. It's actually there to be kind of fun, too. I mean, the Zeitgeist Day event we do is always very, very intense, very straightforward, very dry, in effect. The Media Festival is another way to try and bring this forward, and also, of course, to explore how art can change culture, which I've talked about at length before, and you can read more eloquent descriptions at the ZeitgeistMediaFestival.org, ZeitgeistMediaFestival.org. But we're going to have a TeamSpeak meeting soon with all coordinators that want to be involved in this. And I want to just kind of go down the list of what people can do and get some ideas and start to develop the map. We already have some submissions already, but we want to get momentum going with this. And if you do run a chapter, or if you have a location of just a group of people that are inspired to do something, let us know. You can contact us through the site, and we'll post it and we'll support you and promote it. That's what it is. Now, the lecture team. I did a solicitation a while back for lecture team submissions, and I did get a good handful of them. I apologize for not contacting you back yet. It's really a question of priority at the moment. There's so many things happening at once right now with all of this supplemental material coming out for the movement that's very new, the new 2012 orientation guide. We just finished the chapters guide. We need to get video form stuff with our start, quick start, and all of these other things. But the lecture team, of course, is one of the most critical. As I said before, you can email any videos you have or any documents that you've created. Ideally, though, make videos of this to media@thezeitgeistmovement.com, media@thezeitgeistmovement.com with the subject line lecture team, and you will be reviewed and contacted. What this is in the broadest scheme, to repeat myself, is trying to establish a core intellectual base that can deal with press relations, that could, ideally can actually also be suitable to write press releases, that can take the stress off of what is really still a small group of people at the global level that are creating such documents in the communications team. It takes, as simple as I mentioned earlier in the show, as simple as all of this is, when you encounter questions and explanations, that's when the difficulty comes into play. And as, in fact, I'll go through in a moment with the Q&As that have been sent to me, since I advertised that in this broadcast, you'll begin to understand where, at least those that are new, where these new angles come from and how it's a lot more difficult. You might be able to one-off a statement, but when people start to hit you with numerous questions, you might find that you don't understand the concept as well as you thought you did, or the angles associated. And that's just part of the learning curve, and no one should feel bad about that. I, along with everyone else, try to remain as vulnerable as I can to new information. And as I joked about earlier, someone please debunk all of this so I can do something else and just manipulate the world for my own advantage. If it has to be that way, I've gotten fairly good at being the prick in the market economy. I was not poor before I started all this. I'm a lot more poor now, though, I will admit. I don't have a problem being the parasite or prostitute when it comes to performance. It's my ethic, obviously, and my sense of possibility that has now inhibited me to quite a caustic level, since I can't even walk down the street anymore without seeing gross inefficiency and deprivation and just feeling miserable about the world that's around me. But that's my problem. Point being, we need a core team of people that feel confident in this material in all languages. Ideally, for example, if you have a chapter, look around at those that say maybe have experience in public speaking or presentation or acting or anything that shows confidence in communication with others, and try to see if they're willing to bring themselves forward. If you have something in a different language and you want to send it, if you could do a simple subtitle, you don't have to do the whole thing. Do maybe a 3 or 5 minute segment of the video presentation you're submitting with the subtitle, and we'll bring you on board, hopefully, if of course, after much communication, because meetings will commence with all of this as well. Bilingual certainly helps. But anyway, I'm not going to go on that. I'll be in contact with those that have been in touch with us about that issue, and it will develop as it naturally does. And one final note before I go into questions. I would like to do a theme show. I'm not sure what to do sometimes with the radio show. I mean, there's only so much we can talk about with respect to ongoing projects, and it's very difficult to cover, and it's hard to repeat yourself over and over again. So I'm trying to find new platforms and mediums. Q&As are great. Nevertheless, I want to do a show that's based entirely on criticisms, a show program that comes in, whenever I'm up, in other words, as a host. And it's all based on criticisms. And I don't mean criticisms that are floating above the ether and irrationality. We often get criticized for not countering our detractors, at least I know I have. But then I go back and look at what they want me to counter, and I realize it's someone that says that I and we are a New Age, Luciferian, communist, New World Order cult that wants to take over the world and inhibit Jesus from coming back. That's actually a legitimate criticism that someone asked me to counter once. I'm not kidding. And we'll just leave that to the side. I'm not sure if airtime needs to be wasted on such things like that. However, there are plenty of other people that might completely dislike us, but at least they do it from an intellectually respectable area where they're willing to talk about these things. They're not hiding behind avatars on some blog or things like that, as is the case with the great majority of the people that post random rhetoric against the movement. They're cowards. I don't want the cowards. I want people that actually are willing to come forward, come on the radio show, and actually discuss the issues that they have. And I'm willing to listen and let them bash me and bash the movement live, publicly. I have no problem with that. But, however, I will counter them, and you can rest assured the great majority of their arguments will be completely shattered because I have that much confidence in just about all of the counter arguments I have ever heard, which are so flimsy and so based on projections and false intuitions, and obviously the inhibition of tradition and mind lock. Once you begin to recognize this pattern, it's so easy to shut down the prima facie and straw man-based fallacies. It's like water. And there's my obnoxious challenge to all of the detractors. We'll call it the Peter Joseph Zeitgeist Movement Challenge. How about that? Sorry, excuse me, I'm a little winded today. It's been a long week already. Okay. Yes, and you can send the names of those people, or ideally, please contact them yourself and tell them. I don't want to mediate and waste time. Tell them to email media@thezeitgeistmovement.com with the subject TZM Objections Radio Show, or TZM Objections. That's all they have to say. They can state who they are, state their objections, and we'll find a time for them to come on. They have to have some level of prestige, though. I don't want random YouTube bloggers. I want to talk to people that at least engage the external in some way with their ideas, and they are somewhat publicly recognized. So I hope that helps. I have a feeling I'm not going to get very many submissions for that, but I thought I'd at least throw it out there because I would definitely enjoy that myself. As I was joking earlier, I want someone to prove us wrong. This is too difficult. I want to go back to being a slave and manipulating the world and stepping on people's throats when I walk down the street. This socially conscious altruism shit's for the birds. Just plain. You're all beautiful. It's all a beautiful environment. And it's a beautiful quest. And regardless of where we end up, these seeds are planting. And change will happen one way or another. And I hope we all look back at our lives in the future. And at a bare minimum, we think to ourselves, well, at least I tried. Now, on to questions. I have filtered these questions based on how directly related they are to movement stuff. Not a lot of them, but some of the questions were, approaching the film series or personal issues with me. There were two posts for this. One was on the Zeitgeist Movement's official Facebook, and then there was the other one on my personal Facebook. So I'm going to be bouncing between the two, and I apologize if I skipped your question. It's most likely either I don't have time or I didn't feel it was as relevant to movement stuff as it should be. And that's an unfortunate decision I have to make. I wish I could answer every single question, but we have to create some kind of priority due to time restraints. The first question is by a man named Russell, and he asks, open quotes, Jock often speaks about the abolishment of prisons and police, but it appears you have deviated from this disposition as you referred to it in a prior talk as rhetoric. That fact being considered, how do you think socially disruptive behavior, to include murder and sexual violence, will be negated? Do you still condone the use of formal correctional institutions? Unquote, end of question. Well, Russell, I kind of wish you paid a little more attention because the rhetoric that I stated was more to generalize the concept of the abolition of prisons and police and what it actually means, which is the removal of aberrant behavior. It's not a deviation whatsoever. There is a thing that I call the humanity factor. While we can see the scientific causality of the human being, while we know that there's a cause and effect relationship, it's very complicated. And unfortunately, very little study, in comparison to what's necessary, is being done in the human sciences to think about human causal behavior. In the first section of Zeitgeist Moving Forward, I spent an enormous amount of time expressing that. And one thing I learned from all of those extremely professional people that are much more knowledgeable than Jacques Fresco, by the way, on the issue of human behavior because they study it on a daily basis, what I learned is that there's an element there that is unpredictable. There's always going to be a small percentage that's very, very, very difficult to find the root source of, at least over the course of time. So when I describe what's possible in the future, it's explicitly referencing Jacques' rhetoric. It's the exact same logic, but it isn't with the blanket statement that, okay, in the Venus Project, as they might say, we're abolishing prisons and police. There's an undercurrent that has to deal with that small percentage, that's the victimization, known as I call it, the humanity factor, that's very unpredictable. That doesn't mean you can't remove 99% of the prisons and the prison population. That doesn't mean you can't remove 99% of the police. The approach that we need to take is the understanding of how bad our system is as far as its approach to correcting human behavior, realizing the root source of human behavior, and applying the scientific method, obviously, from the ground up, meaning from the very beginning of the social institution's placement in the human life. In other words, from the moment people are born, there needs to be an understanding of how they are culminated. And that's unfortunately long lost. Parents don't get any education on how kids should be raised. Some of the horrors, if you read Gabor Mate, he describes some of the horrors and irrational logic that parents used to use on their children, especially in infancy, that disturbed them for their entire life, created emotional loss. You look at people, Charles Manson's a classic example of a generated psychopath. The guy was in and out of prison his whole life. He came from a horrible family background. It's very easy to see, but it's also difficult to predict at what point and in what confluence of events such actions will emerge. I hope that's understandable. I just feel it's almost negligent to just say that there will be a world without police and prisons when you begin to understand the complexity of the human condition. I don't know enough about the human condition, nor does anyone else, nor does Jacques, nor does the greatest scientific minds on the planet, to say that we can abolish all forms of aberrant behavior based on the sociological definition of aberrancy, which is, of course, relative to the social environment. That's too difficult. But there's an enormous amount of information there that can subside all of that. So to summarize my point, yes, we can approach it. We can hyperbolate towards no prisons and police. But that extra 1%, that extra point, that's going to be very difficult to overcome, and it's going to probably take a long period of time. So to answer your final question, do I condone the use of formal correctional institutions? Formal correctional institutions, no. As they exist today, people should not be punished for anything. Except past a certain point. Children can deal with punishment, not physical abuse, not emotional abuse, but putting correction. Children don't know any better. And what happens at these young stages is this inhibition's created where people don't mature properly, and punishment just makes them worse because their maturity is not there. When you look at adults that have severe problems and violence, it's a maturity issue on a certain level. And it comes from certain things that shouldn't have happened and certain things that should have happened, in the words of Gabor Mate. And this is how this type of aberrancy of behavior is culminated. And it's not specific and 100% as far as how we understand it. And there are lots of factors. That's my point. But people should be put in caring facilities. Those that attribute those that commit such atrocities should be put in facilities that don't threaten them, but they can be studied and they can be interviewed and understood as to what happened to them. And you'll find that everything I've just said is actually completely in line with what Jacques Fresco talks about. I was simply addressing the overarching statement, which I think is far too gratuitous and turns a lot of people off in communication when you talk that way, because it just sounds way too, quote, utopian. And I've tried my best in communication to find ways to communicate what are completely intellectually stable concepts, but in a way that inches the person into the concept to understand the rationality of it. And I could talk at great length about the horrors of the prison system and how inefficient it is and how many intellectual individuals have come forward to describe that it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It makes it worse, such as Dr. James Gilligan. These are people that you should start to research. And they'll tell you that you could solve a lot of problems. But there is, of course, that humanity factor and that one element that we don't understand, and if there's anything that science has proven us, is that we do not understand everything, and there will always be something new we don't understand. So you have to take that into consideration as a phenomenon. Next question. This is from Patrick, and he asks, quote, what happens in a resource-based economic model when a resource has a greater demand than supply? Closed quote, end of question. That depends on what the resource's functionality is. Substitution is something that isn't given enough credence in this society, especially in the wake of nanotechnology and a lot of amazing abundance-producing methods that are on the horizon. But let's assume for a moment those abundance-producing methods are not there. Let's assume for a moment that oil is the only major energy source. Let's assume for a moment that the trees that we use to build homes, there's no other way to build homes without trees. Let's assume that our traditional patterns of using resources are static and they cannot be substituted, which is not the case, but let's use this as a thought exercise. What would a sane, rational society do? Well, first of all, you would design your economic system to counter that. In other words, preservation would become the ultimate modus operandi of the civilization, knowing that you have the option of running out. So you'd have organization based on preservation. Second, you would do a trend analysis constantly, looking at the depletion rates of anything that you're using, and of course, natural regeneration. With that dynamic equilibrium information, safeguards can be made to thwart that possibility before it happens. But let's assume it does happen. Let's assume that one day a given city doesn't have access to whatever energy medium they may be using. We'll just assume it's a hydrocarbon economy still. Well, there's two trains of thought here. If you advocate the monetary system, then that energy would go to whoever has the money. Is that really stabilizing? Is that really a way of organization? What happens to those that are deprived? Doesn't that create problems on many different levels, psychologically, sociologically? Aren't there case histories of scarcity-driven environments that result in riots and other forms of destabilization? Just as money would serve as that medium to very haphazardly allow for who gets what, a system would be organized to distribute that scarcity in a particular way. And you could do that through the consensus of the population. To put it a different way, in a society that's actually based on producing abundance, not scarcity as it is today, in a society that's actually trying to meet human needs directly in the most expansive way, yet conservative and strategic way possible, such an issue, such a crisis, when it does happen, will be treated in a very different way than it is today, meaning the public won't react as badly because they know that corrective measures would be in order. If it's really true that the actual physical resource is being diminished, it will be foreshadowed, and it should be a very rare circumstance for such a surprise where suddenly, boom, I don't know, there's no water in a given region. And if there's such a problem, it's corrected once again. The entire system is based on that rationale and approach, which is more or less the opposite of what we have today. So I hope that helps. Crises can happen. And in the event of any crisis, it's all a matter of the education of the public and their confidence in the environment to correct itself, meaning in the system that they support. And I can't say that we can do that in any better facility today. And at the end of the day, I consider the most pertinent relationship here with respect to a new social system, the most pertinent relationship is its comparison to the insanity and belligerence of the modern society. We want to improve society. It won't be a utopia. We're not saying that suddenly there's an abundance of every possible thing you can imagine. That's impossible. But in an educated population that understands the system, the crisis associated with the reduction of a resource and supply not meeting demand will be treated very, very differently and hopefully rationally, and with the intention of immediate correction, foreshadowed in advance, because that's what the social system is designed for. Next question, this one is from Fabian, and I'm going to paraphrase this because it's kind of long. Basically, his question is that the concept of family as described in an RBE by the Venus Project is that children would be raised by people who would choose roles as caretakers and the parents would continue with their roles within society. In other words, there's a certain concept of separation. Parents wouldn't be forced to leave the children, but it would be an option, he denotes. And then he says, according to Gabor Mate, children that are adopted have a feeling of loss at a young age and become susceptible to addiction. This seems like a contradiction. What do I think? Close quote, end of question. I would have to say the jury's still out on such an issue. It really doesn't matter who the child is raised by. It's the values and communication of those parental figures, or whatever you want to call them. It's a little too arbitrary to think about such specifics in family relations. I mean, the broad scope really is just the communication and the raising of the child. I will say that there is evidence to support that I've read within Gabor Mate and, of course, Robert Sapolsky, that shows that there is a bond. There's an element, whether it's a reaction, a pre-learning that occurs at the very earliest stages that's triggered, or it's somehow built into the evolutionary psychology, or biopsychology, if you will. Very hard to predict, as I mentioned in the prior question on causality. The connections made at the earliest stages, even in utero and in childbirth, early infancy, those connections are indeed important. I don't think they go unnoticed, if you will, in the subconscious and the implicit memory. There seems to be evidence to support that. But the jury's still somewhat out on all those issues. At the end of the day, family or whomever the figures are, it's really about what they communicate to the child, coupled with the implicit memory of that child, how they physiologically relate to the mother. The father, probably not as relevant as the mother is based on the research. So I'm going to leave it at that, because it's an extremely complex question that I don't know the answer to, and ultimately not a very important question in the scope of what we have to contend with at the moment in the broad scale. Next question from Ambroge, I believe is how I pronunciate it. Open quote, what role would space exploration take in an RBE, considering how space exploration is conducted through money, NASA, etc.? Would there be a place for space exploration, and how would it be used? Close quote, end of question. Obviously, space exploration would be a very pertinent thing for any society to do, just as we slowly began to transverse the oceans, and in the words of Carl Sagan, it's simply a cosmic ocean out there. And as far as the money issue, I mean, why, if you understand the premise of how things get done in a system without money, as has been described at length in numerous materials, the allocation of resources for space exploration would not see any problem whatsoever. It would be considered an immense social imperative. Again, it's part of what we've been doing since the beginning of humanity, is to explore and to kind of find ourselves at the same time. Carl Sagan was always very beautiful in that regard. Next question. This question is from, I believe, Chori. Question, open quote, how does a resource-based economy do away with economic calculation problem? The economic calculation problem, unquote, end of question. The economic calculation problem was put forward first by Ludwig von Mises, and it's essentially an assumption that says that the price mechanism in the market economy must be there because there's no other way to determine essentially demand and to take account for shortages and surpluses and things of such. It's based essentially on the presupposition that human behavior is irrational, believe it or not, at least irrational in the broad sense of seeking infinite wants, and that you have to have this overlay mechanism that's based on interactions in the system in order to control production efficiently, if they want to use that term. We're talking market efficiency, not physical or ecological efficiency. Huge difference. And you wouldn't be able to make these types of decisions rationally or calculate correctly the economy without the price mechanism. This is a very convoluted assumption as far as I'm concerned, and I don't quite understand how it's defended when a scientific approach is taken to the organization of society. The only way, as I mentioned earlier, that this can be justified is with the assumption that human beings are basically operating with infinite wants and they're completely irrational. And you can't organize irrationality. You have to more or less suppress it through this internal rationale that equates to price. Now, I will admit off the cuff that price is unique in that sense. On a certain superficial level, it does do this job if the information is properly obtained, which is also very, very suspect. Supply and demand is easy to manipulate in the market economy. It's to say that it's without manipulation, that it's always accurate and reflective in price, is a very, very loaded assumption. That's very untrue, because the data is actually very poorly communicated across the price system. Anyway, beyond that, if you simply step back and take an island and you put a bunch of people there, they live off the island, they create their own economy, and you examine the protocols that they would establish, the parameters required to maintain a balanced, rational load with that island, dynamic equilibrium. They maintain production that could meet the needs without shortages and scarcity, and, overruns as well. All of that can be done through a scientific method. All of that can be done through simply paying attention and doing a trend analysis and watching what's happening. It's the assumption of infinite wants, again, that makes it irrational and makes this claim, this opposition, seem rational. A steady state economy was also admitted by Ludwig von Mises to have the ability to work in a particular context. And it's on a certain level, there's again a very deep-seated presupposition with all of this. Not to mention, as a final criticism, the assumptions that are felt as important that regulate the economy are actually quite petty. They're not really related to actual true economic function. They're related to human behavior orientations of function, and they ignore the vast technicals. The huge problem in our society today is that the population isn't thinking about the ramifications of what they're consuming. And the reflection of those issues in price are very, very narrow. Basically, all you have is shortages. So you have scarcity of something, the price goes up. That doesn't tell you anything about how those scarce resources should be utilized. That's extremely irrational, just to have price go up and let the wealthy be able to purchase all of something that's going scarce, when you could easily understand that you approach things in a systems theory and you approach things based on rational organization of the utility of particular resources. Then it means allocation of those resources should become more specific and more rational, if you will, based on the most efficient use of them. Now, I could go on a long tangent about different issues like that are long lost in our economic system because they're not really truly economic when it comes to the price mechanism, the monetary system. As far as monetary economists are concerned, those issues aren't relevant. And how they're reflected in price is actually quite superficial. It doesn't benefit anything other than the acknowledgement of it, which is very poor. So to summarize that, the economic calculation problem isn't the problem if you take a systems theory approach and respect the natural dynamics of the world with the basic understanding that human behavior can change. It can be more rational in a scientific sense. We don't have to operate in the consumption mentality and the infinite wants. If you accept those premises, then there's no basis for the economic calculation problem because it's just another form of organization of anything inventory you'd see in a factory. And I will just leave it at that. That should be enough. Next question by Tyler, open quote question. I understand that the efficiency of a resource-based economy would eliminate the majority of crime, but I think it would be helpful to consider possible solutions to deal with rare people like serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer, who had not been subjected to any obvious abuse. Clearly, our current prison system is a failure, but I don't think most people can conceive of a different way, so maybe you could describe an effective way to rehabilitate criminals. Unquote, end of question. Well, this goes back to the prior question, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I think I answered it already. Very simply, we have a humanity factor. Jeffrey Dahmer, I think, is a good example of the humanity factor. And it's where things are very hard to predict. You know, the psychological turmoil that occurs with people can be much stronger than the physical turmoil. It's well established. I'm going to do a big essay on free speech soon because I think it's unique to see how people will support free speech, but they won't support free action. And in the end, they're actually the exact same thing, especially when it comes to what it does to people on certain levels. But I will say that while it might not appear that Dahmer has a history of abuse that was typical of a lot of other serial killers out there, the psychological ramifications of his upbringing are very hard to predict. There's so many pockets of isolation with a figure like that, and this is where, discussion and analysis in a scientific way, we're taking the individual, don't put him in prison. You have a very rare anomaly here. It's almost a gold mine for human behavior. If you realize the symbiotic element, you realize how we're all similar, realize how we're susceptible to the environment, and yes, there is a genetic basis to behavior on a certain level that can be triggered, and we want to know what those triggers can be in the case of, say, schizophrenia, things of the like. Accumulated psychosis, there's tons of work on this that are environmentally related, but they can have a genetic basis that is opened up due to the environment. Again, a lot of that was talked about in Zeitgeist Moving Forward, Part 1. When you understand all of that, you begin, this is a gold mine. You want to take the individual and you want to study them, you want to figure out what the hell happened. And that's really all I could say to that. And then you'll overcome it. But the vast majority of those issues can and easily find linkage to deprivation on a very obvious scale. And it really becomes a social issue, an imperative of sorts, to be very, very careful with the way people were brought up and treated in this society. And that is of an enormous educational imperative. That is very much the way that people need to be educated with respect to how they interact in their community, with the understanding that they're planting seeds constantly. They're shaping behavior all the time. It's unfortunate to see how crude the organization is in early life, and the reciprocal kind of demeaning. The old saying that children can be mean. They don't have to be that way, but there's something that's happening in the system that forces these insecurities very, very obviously, and like a disease, it spreads and it mutates, and suddenly you end up with the bully mentality, or suddenly you end up with severe inferiority complex mentality, which can erupt in later life. It's not easy. It's not easy to analyze those things, so I can't pretend to answer your question that showed us some resolution. I could talk at length about other research that I've done personally on people that develop, dopamine reactions. They're developing pleasure centers with abuse, especially someone like Dahmer, who sort of combined the sexual element with his violence. These things can be manifest based on repetition, and it's a very, very dark, to say the least, but again, it's complex. Back to my general point, while that might be hard to understand, that is a very, very, very small percentage of the deprivation causing crime out there, crime caused by deprivation. And this is back to the issue of where, yes, in the future you might still have to contain people in a humane way, though, not in prisons and metal bars. But things will improve over time. Next question. This question is from Ahmed. If the change of values is what matters most, how is TZM going to change them by mostly talking about technical possibilities, economy, and so on? Isn't there a need for a more direct approach exposing false values, unquote, end of question? That's a terrific question, and I would say yes, there is. The hope, though, is when you describe the technical possibilities, it will illuminate the false values, because most values today are centered around a very narrow frame of reference, self-indulgent reference, that is absent the larger synergistic understanding. The greatest debate, it's interesting to me, in fact, as an aside, looking at the Occupy movement, I was going back through some presidential debates randomly, and I was amazed to see that nothing has changed under the sun. The core argument since the beginning of America and throughout almost all of Europe and the general history of humanity has been the class battle, basically, coming in different forms, between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. Nothing's new under the sun. And if that doesn't allude to us of a value distortion, of a conflict-generating value distortion, I'm not sure what is. To show the real core necessity of this resolution for the improvement of society. Nevertheless, approaches to changing values are very much ongoing in the movement, from the Zeitgeist Media Festival, the Zeitgeist Media Project, to pretty much the undercurrent of everything that we do. It's always, in a way, about values. That's why a lot of my talks always go into that at some point. It's just the hope that people will see the technical possibility and they'll begin to conform their values, recognize the falseness of their values, and from that logical underlay, begin to see the importance of the change that's required. That's all you can really hope for, and I think all of us are doing whatever we can in strategy to accomplish exactly what your question is about, and that's exposing false values and getting people to change. This is what the thought exercise is, and everyone out there should be thinking about means to do this ultimately. But you have to get there somehow, and that's where the technical possibilities come into play. Otherwise, people just think you're criticizing them without being rational, without something to balance the scales. You have to show causality in thought, and that's why religious thought and such is so difficult to deal with, because they've already denounced causality. They've already denounced a linkage relationship to support whatever they believe, because it's based on faith. And unfortunately, in an economic context, faith is equally as strong as it is in the dogmatic religious context. Next question. This question is from Christopher. Question, open quote. When do we as a movement call out our political leaders as being completely corrupted and establish an alternative government with the goal of rescuing the earth by enabling sustainability, unquote, end of question? Well, most of our materials imply, quote, corruption of political leaders inherently. I think that's obvious enough. But you have to understand that the political leaders aren't actually corrupt per se. The whole system is a corruption of the natural law economy. and everything else is a consequence. So the political leaders are doing exactly what they've been taught to do and exactly what's reinforced for them to do. So they're not really corrupt. They're actually perfectly in line with the corrupted system. So I hope that logic makes sense. It's just that the system itself is a large, huge corruption that works against the natural order of reality, and that's a core underlying issue that I think isn't understood enough, frankly. This isn't about people being bad. This is about bad system influences and really hideous traditions that have now taken on the name normality. As far as an alternative government and improving things, this is a complex issue and we're not there yet. Invariably, it's an educational process. I've advocated a while back making a parallel government system, which isn't really a government at all. It's actually a group of technicians that are working to show the world what can be done technically, which comes back to the Global Redesign Institute and some other ideas, where the attention of the public begins to shift. They start to lose faith in their political leaders, and they start to think to themselves, you know what, this group of thinking people over here, these scientists over here, these creative thinkers and engineers over here, they seem to have better things to say about possibility and organization than these politician people over here. And there's your shift of consciousness. It's the best we can hope for, at least on a fundamental level. A lot more could be said as well as far as step-by-step processes, but the first role is always education. And if you want to live in a world where you're making your own decisions, where you're not part of an oppressive environment where you're being told what to think and you have no control, people need to understand this across the board on their own level. The days of everyone being ignorant and controlled, those have to change if such a progression that we advocate is to come to fruition. People like to say that what we describe as an imposition, that it would create tyranny. No, it wouldn't have the possibility of creating tyranny, because it's based upon everyone understanding the fundamental premise. If the whole of society understands the technical relationship scientifically, if you can get that point across, simple, then they'll begin to adapt their values. They'll have to, because nothing else will begin to make sense. And they will not only accept the system, they will actively contribute with it, as opposed to what we have today, which is systematically and structurally designed to inhibit contribution, to create narrow frames of debate, and the like. So I don't want to ramble too much because I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to keep going, but thank you for your question. Next question from a name that I cannot pronunciate, and I won't even try. The question reads, apathy. What do we do about apathy? Had an Occupy GA meeting, and there are only 3 of us showing up, very disheartening, so we decided to focus on creating a community garden. There are 14,000 people in our town. You'd think more people would want to get involved. End of comment, unquote. So the apathy issue typically has to do with people that are just comfortable enough, just willing to accept their deprivation enough that they just don't have the energy or the interest to get involved in the interest in change. And that's where the biosocial pressure of the failure of society will come into play. The problem, again, also is not just apathy, it's docility. It's the accepting of their, quote, oppression, if you want to call it that, which is quite a real distinction, in fact. So apathy and docility, which I find a slight differentiation between, are the two biggest barriers that we have psychologically in the culture. The 2 angles to it, as far as I'm concerned, is communicating what's possible. Even if someone that's relatively well-to-do, that has accomplished in this system, that has gotten money and they're surviving and they're living what in a cultural sense is a higher level of existence. They have a little vacation house, blah, blah, blah. They still have an empathetic response to their environment, most likely. And if you begin to show them that a lot of the deprivation around them isn't necessary, they'll begin to extend themselves. And they might actually be able to overcome their values once again and gain interest in improving society, even though they personally aren't suffering directly as far as they're concerned. That's one side. The other side, of course, are the people that are directly inhibited, the poverty-stricken, the vast majority on the planet, the ones without resources. And I think in that circumstance, they're brainwashed. And it's unfortunate. I don't know what to say about that. It's an educational issue, ultimately. People are born into an environment. All they know is the environment they're born into, especially if it's poverty-stricken. They can't see outside of it. The implication of society being that your self-worth is reflected in your financial success, that can be very inhibiting on someone's psychology and make them feel simply like they're a worthless human being, which, again, inhibits their motivation for change If you just make them feel like they're just not good enough, well, then they'll cower down and they'll just accept whatever they get. Lots of psychological issues like that. But it is a big issue, and again, the movement's trying its best to communicate what's possible in the hope to inspire people to create and want change. Next question from Jared, open quote, "It seems in a RBE there would be construction going on all the time to account for new technologies. Everything would always be updating, right?" End of question. One of the differences, I believe, in the approach, which is not, it has nothing to do with the RBE, just has to do with practical reasoning, is the modular and transferable nature of things that are established in infrastructure. Because of financial limitations, there's a very crude method in the infrastructure of society with highways and things of such. Very hard to access. They have to dig the streets up. A lot more thought, if we step back, can be put into how we update the infrastructure of society. So construction probably wouldn't look anything like what we see today in the horrors of Los Angeles or New York. You would systematically design cities where you access what needs to be changed for the most part. You could do it, you could foreshadow it to a pretty decent degree, just like you can foreshadow updating goods without having to take the good, trash them, and reconstruct an entire new good. You work out the variables, you analyze the trends of what's most likely to change with the technology, and you create facilities to apply it without having to nullify the existence of the entire edifice to which it's a part. That's a very simple, rational approach, and I'm sure that would take hold, and construction would be nothing as far as its haphazard nature and inconvenience nature like it is today, which, again, is just an issue of better organization. Next question from Christian. "After talking with a politician running for governor whose background is in engineering about an RBE, I was getting into detail about the process of automation. He told me he spent time in Iraq and was dedicated towards building power grids and electrical infrastructures. Point being, he told me two things I didn't have answers to. The first one being you cannot use geothermal technology. According to him, it's extremely dangerous and has to this date not been achieved on a grand scale. Second point he told me, which is the more important one, is automation is not a solution because it can never be traced back to the original source. So if you have a restaurant which makes food by automation, then who carries the food there? Who obtained the seeds? Who went to the distant country to get the seeds? Who planted the seeds, etc.? He said you can't automate all the way back to the source because it infinitely goes back." Okay, end of question. The first issue regarding geothermal, I'm not sure why the governor is answering what is a core scientific question on geothermal. Please reference the MIT study done a number of years ago about the possibility of geothermal, and then look at the trends that are happening in technology related to it. And couple that in with the general expansion of with information technology, and you'll begin to see that there's an immense amount of possibility. There are issues associated, there are negative retroactions, but they can be understood and they can be countered and improved. There's nothing out there that I've seen, apart from general grievances of certain circumstances, that are actually low in percentage in relationship that would inhibit all of geothermal being used. So that's kind of a ridiculous statement by your political friend running for government. It's way out of what he even understands. Second of all, the issue of automation, I think he's creating a straw man out of this. I mean, he's creating a really bizarre projection with respect to what he understands the point to be of automation. It's not going all the way back to, quote, the source. It's not that you automate every attribute of society. You automate what's possible. And given the fact that almost all production and lots of extraction is done through automated systems on some level, except in the very sad, deprived, sulfur mines where you have these poor people that are being exploited and there's no technological advancement, but that's an economic ramification that's not actually based on technical reality. With that, automation is there to free humans from monotonous labor, and if applied diligently and liberally, you can overcome a great amount. It's about the improvement. So these dismissals make absolutely no sense to me. Next question from Callum. "Hi, Peter. I feel there needs to be a project centered around the compilation of research from multiple areas, including motivation, human behavior, social inequality, etc., which can be developed into a kind of academic journal that can be presented to the scientific community. An issue often discussed by both you and Jock is how specialized the current scientific community is, and in turn how restricted and subject specific current scientific perspectives are. Perhaps this would be an effective starting point in tackling this issue. What do you think, and how would such a project be set up?" Well, if I understand your question, it basically means you create a peer-reviewed type of environment for scientists to examine the data sets relevant to a new social system. And the New Orientation Guide and a lot of books have been written more or less based on that premise. You have to understand we're pulling from a multi-disciplined arena, if you will, where all of this science and engineering comes together for social concern. And I'm hoping that with the New Orientation Guide, a lot of that is achieved because it's really based on referencing what's unfolding out there in pockets and putting it into the social consideration, creating the social imperative based on that information for the improvement of society. So yes, having an academic journal of sorts really is kind of the same thing of what's being created with new materials that are coming out for the movement, and really is actually should be the basis of any text that's written with the serial relationship to their sourcing. There's nothing worse than reading a book that has no sources. That drives me nuts because no one's really venting any of the things that they talk about. You have to show where it's coming from, and the diligence of the reader is to trace back as far as they can to find the validity of particular propositions and find the support for them. So invariably, everything that we try to produce will have the constant sourcing, ideally to scientific reference, since that's the majority of the context, or a human study, which invariably all causality is scientific, so it's always going to have the relationship of such. And it's our job as researchers to always show these source confluences with the things that we state. It seems self-evident to me, but yes, back to your question, I do agree that such a journal of sorts, or that approach, should be taken, and that's exactly the type of approach I'm trying to take right now with the essays that I'm writing for the Orientation Guide, with enormous amount of sourcing, almost obnoxious amount of sourcing. So no one can just think that, oh, this individual wrote this and it's his own ideas. I don't have any original ideas, and neither do you. And it's important that we show the serial development of all of this. This next question is from Richard. Hey, Peter, could you expand upon any ideas you have for science going social? I know what you were saying, but have you had further thoughts regarding tactics for scientific community to engage with? I would say the closest thing we have is Neil Tyson, who seems to make media circuit fairly often, interjecting a little science in the conversation. End of question, unquote. The issue of scientific awareness in society is probably the most important. It's really the worldview that people have to start to think about because it's provably the causal nature of the world around us, from human behavior to everything else. It is the greatest defining feature of our awareness. We spent thousands and thousands of years inventing very strange stories about reality, hence the birth of superstition, religion, metaphysics, and the like, many of which are still here today. Not to put those practices down per se, but if you're not willing to overcome your belief system when new information emerges, then you have a neurotic problem. It's that simple. And science has been and will continue to be, as far as we can tell, the only causality indicator that can be supported through testing and be seen through repetition and show constant confirmation of the reality as we know it through scientific causality. There's nothing else out there that can do this, and that's why faith is the cornerstone of other belief systems, which are not based on the necessity for reinforcement through causal relationships. Validity of ideas is not a subjective thing. Validity of physical phenomenon undergoes a process of testing, reinforcement, and the questioning of that validity pretty much until the end of time, because of the way that the evolution of knowledge emerges and new information is always changing itself, always changing our sense of understanding of every phenomenon. And that's a daunting realization, but it's the way it is, and it needs to be respected. So all of my behaviors with respect to media, the films that I make, the new films I'm going to make, the old film series, the Culture in Decline show, me personally, it's all based around trying to communicate this type of causality one way or another, and I hope everyone out there does the same thing. That's very much part of, if people don't understand the way the world works on this fundamental level, and it isn't even a specialization thing. You don't have to have a PhD in physics to understand the scientific worldview. People use this logic all the time. They just don't know what they're doing, and they frame themselves very rigidly with borders that they will never surpass due to their value system. I don't know how many times I run into people, for example, that don't like the first part of my first movie, and they're using scientific thought to try to debunk the film through causal relationships, through sources or what have you. And it's unique to me because what they're defending, however, is absolutely absent of the causal defense that they're using against my film. It's fascinating. It's truly fascinating. Next question from Richard. Hi, there are currently 850 million people around the world who are 60 years and older. In an RBE, how would old people be looked after? Would there be designated areas and cities that are specifically designed for old people to live? Who would look after them? How can technology assist? Well, this is very much a cultural and social issue. And the patterns historically, we separate old people. I don't know if that's really something that's a good idea. I think there's a lot of, because of the economic system, the difficulty of taking care of people that are aging, specifically when they get to points where they're enfeebled, or senility, or geriatric type of tendencies emerge, where there is the necessity for being taken care of. Facilities obviously can be created just like they exist today, but at a much higher and more efficient level. They wouldn't be inhibited by the budget restraints. And I think really it's a social issue, it's cultural. How do these people prefer to interact? I think over the course of history, there's been this tendency to take people like that and put them into a facility and get them away from society, as though no one wants to deal with them or something. You know what I mean? I think that's a very despotic and probably a consequence of the financial system and people's inability to take care of their loved ones directly, so they have to take them away. To put it very simply, though, in the end, if you care about the aging process, the system will be designed to handle in the most humane and beneficial way such issues. It's simply part of the plan and the recognition of the general unfolding of society. The aging process is very natural. Just as you still have care centers for little children with certain needs, the exact same logic is applied. I don't see why it would be that much different per se, except it would remove the inefficiency and maybe would change the culture as far as how we interact. We always forget how our culture has been groomed around the economic imposition. And I think a lot of stuff when it comes into this context really wouldn't be the same way. We'd have a very different view of each other when we don't feel that fiscal tension that's constant, especially when it comes to healthcare and things like that. Next question is from Anthony. Open quote, this question is directed towards educational awareness. An overview of an RB has specific fields which we need to fill to properly sustain and operate the human socioeconomic system. How would you suggest to people the kind of educational information required at this current moment of time relating to the required amount of people needed to sustain and operate the current demand for any element of the RBE? Okay, that's basically the question. The educational imperatives are really educational imperatives that relate to general Earth awareness overall. The educational system from the earliest age should really be about how to survive. If people learn how to grow food, if they learn the basic fundamentals, forget the specifics of terminology and rote learning, show the process. When kids hit the youngest age in elementary school, get them out in the field and grow things. Even if automation is huge at that point, you show them where things are coming from. You show scientific causality in its operation. I think that's a huge value that's long lost, but that's probably an aside. As far as the actual specifics of who operates the city system, you need people that are advanced, obviously, in automation and programming. You need people that understand systems theory very clearly. And ultimately, really, the entire educational system should be based on these types of approaches anyway, at least the root of what they're attempting to accomplish. The actual tools being used become arbitrary. The awareness of the systems and the unfolding is the most important issue. And it's important to also remember, and this might be a little too advanced, that the interaction with machines becomes critical because of the calculation power that exceeds human comprehension. This is how the future will unfold, and it already unfolds today already. So if you were to imagine an educational system a couple hundred years from now, I think people will be brought into the understanding of the very youngest age regarding scientific causality. It would be at the core. They would be pushed to have their values associated, and they will work in engineering fields that relate to the way society unfolds and is analyzed and progresses thereof to whatever effect is required and would logically be deduced. And then, of course, the interaction with machines for making decisions is extremely important, and the understanding that our minds are just calculators And we can calculate society on multiple levels with high efficiency without the subjective interference and bias of the human condition that we see today, which is rampant and which is what's controlling everything for the most part. Political institutions, everything else, it's all moral, haphazard stuff based on values, no technical basis at all. I hope that helps. Next question from a name I cannot pronunciate. Open question, how do you reconcile the exponential population growth with a steady state RBE? End of question, unquote. Well, exponential population growth, by its very implication, cannot be sustained. So you have to have an educational imperative, and you have to create balance in the system where the procreation patterns don't materialize. And if you look at the poverty-stricken nations of the world, they produce many times faster than those that are of a balanced nature, meaning the wealthy West. So there's an implication there based on deprivation and education, and the pattern's quite clear. It appears that the more satisfied the environment, the less reproduction actually occurs, which is contrary to most people's logic. They think that if there's an abundance of things, people feel more inclined to procreate. Actually, that's not the case. And there could be religious implications and other philosophical things that are in there as well, but there seems to be a general educational problem, and if people understand the world that they're in, that they're born into, without the superstitious overlay and the fantasy overlay of infinite everything, which seems to permeate much of culture today, then they will think twice about having children and what that actually means in the context of the larger society. I would have to say, in my personal view, having children is one of the most important things that any human being can do. You're putting something new into the environment that can alter the environment and can be altered by the environment. I know it creates great controversy to speak this way, but there has to be an educational program for people when they decide to bring people into the world. And I'll also add as a final point that there's a denatured quality out there as well. There's something that's happened, especially in the Western societies, where whatever intuition did exist, if you will, that assisted in natural, balanced upbringing of children, creating, not generating emotional loss, and really trying to nourish the child. A lot of that's been long lost and denatured in our monetary economies because of the pressures associated. And a lot of work has been done on that issue by Dr. Gabor Mate, which I recommend. Okay, next question. This one's from Luke. Question, open quote, do you have a term that describes the erroneous projection of the group mind of the time onto future progressive expectations? The reason I ask is this seems to be at the core of the human nature argument. With stubbornly short attention spans, we need efficient ways to dismantle indoctrinated ideas. Unquote, end of question. I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but it is not difficult to understand that if you're born and indoctrinated into a particular environment, you begin to see only what you've come to understand. Therefore, you begin to create your reality continuously by projecting old values and old assumptions that have been taught to you. That's basic enough in common psychological, sociological study. As far as a term for it, no, not really. I mean, it's cultural projection, and it's sort of it's continuing to reinforce old values in sort of the mind lock of association where the limits of debate are firmly established and the tradition just keeps unfolding. So to dismantle such traditional ideas, these traditional, this non-evolution of tradition that's very consistent in society, you just have to keep hitting people with new information and breaking that line and starting new trends. I'm going to start moving more quickly now due to time restraints. This question's from Kasia, I believe it's Kasia. Let's see. Zeitgeist Project seems to be oriented on a large scale, total change. But what about attempts to make small-scale transformations? My impression is that your vision of change is an all-or-nothing idea. Okay, I don't want to be hit with too many things. In regard to the question by Fabian Ruse, which is another poster, the experiences of the kibbutz give some warning lessons about experimenting with family forms. Okay, to summarize, he's asking about small-scale changes, why we always push a large-scale total earth change, and then there's another secondary question with respect to familial things. Regarding the familial issue and the experience of the kibbutz, the reference you're making is how they divide their society. which I question is actually scientific. Again, we're dealing with tradition, and it's the roots of human behavior and how they interrelate is not an easy subject, and I think that there's a great deal of variance possible while also maintaining the strictness of scientific causality with respect to how people are being brought up and where their values are. So that's stated in the side. As far as the large-scale issue of change, why do we push the large scale? Because the small changes aren't actually resolution of anything. It's only when the total system is considered that we have. Now, you can argue that the total system goes far outside of the planet Earth. It incorporates the sun, the solar system. You can get more abstract with it. But let's focus on what's tangibly relevant. The Earth system, symbiotically related, fairly closed in its atmosphere, obviously interconnected with the sun and everything else, pull of gravity. However, it's the system itself and the human species that we're dealing with as the fundamental issue. Therefore, we have to organize ourselves on that level. So while we can talk about small communities and we can talk about improvement on such level, the human species is still in one central, synergistic, symbiotic-related Earth system at this stage, and the only logical orientation can be to consider the whole. There's just no other way to think about it scientifically. That's it. And that's why we don't focus so much on that. But that doesn't mean we put down projects that are looking for small-scale transformation. It's going to have to start on some level in the small scale as far as transition, but we have to keep the large, globally conscious view if we expect it to really take root. Next question, this is from Matt. Question, how does the Zeitgeist Movement create an environment platform that incentivizes the members and non-members to participate in activism? Okay, well, your incentive to want change in the world, hence be activist-oriented, isn't going to come from the Zeitgeist Movement per se. It's going to come from viewing the way the world out there is operating and realizing the potential that we have. So I'm not, we're not trying to create the necessity per se. We're trying to bring awareness to relevant issues, and if people see the importance of it, then they will join and hopefully join a chapter and do activism. I'm not sure how else to answer the question. It's not the pressure of the movement to influence people per se necessarily. It's the pressure of the surrounding world and what's happening, coupled with the scientific possibility. I guess if there's anything the Zeitgeist Movement wants to do, it's to bring attention to those two issues, and through that, it's up to the receiving mind to make the decision if they find it relevant or not. Next question by Jay. Long question, but please hear me out. Hold on, let me paraphrase this. He asks, I've come to the conclusion that we're never going to get anything close to a critical mass by simply talking about a better world and trying to communicate verbally. Doesn't this movement advocate the scientific method for decision-making? If that's the case, studies by educational researchers suggest that approximately 83% of human learning occurs visually, and the remaining 17% through other senses, 11% through hearing. So we're going to completely ignore 90% of how people grasp new concepts and learn in favor of keeping the integrity of the direction, he says in quotes. How do you respond to this? End of question. I'm kind of confused by your point, Jay. If 83% of human learning occurs visually, that means probably through reading and also viewing materials in a media context. That's an enormous percentage that can be accomplished, through learning in that medium. So at this stage, we're not trying to preserve some direction. I'm not quite sure what you're implying, frankly. The integrity of the direction is based explicitly on its inherent logic, nothing that we do per se. And we're simply doing the best we can to communicate this, to make the imperative to act upon it. It's that simple. Your criticism, we're not going to achieve anything close to critical mass by simply talking about a better world. Well, we're doing more than talking. There's seeds that have been planted. There are actions that will materialize. There's different stages to this and different layers. I'm sorry to say, until people understand this, there's not a whole lot we can do. And even if we did other larger actions, such as building, it's still going to be based on someone understanding why that structure has been constructed the way it is, et cetera, and so forth. So, the next question. This question is from Sharon. Hi, Peter. I'm observing the movement. Inspiring question. Whoever controls excuse me. Question: whoever controls reproduction controls the future. Women give birth to humanity, and there are approximately 2.5 billion so-called females on the planet. The movement appears to lack this insight. Reproduction has been appropriated by the system. It is to the most repressed group on the planet that the movement needs to talk to. End of question. I understand your observation, and we can look at the long history of superstition and religious and philosophical oppression of women with great disdain. And you can only hope that the pattern of equality that's slowly been emerging in society will continue and these biases will subside. I'm not really sure how else to respond to that except acknowledging the pattern. Obviously, the Zeitgeist Movement shows a universal respect, and obviously women hold an obvious role in the perpetuation of the species and are equally as important as everything else in this synergistic continuum. So that's very intrinsic in everything that we postulate with respect to system reorientation. Any creed, race, sexuality, gender division is immediately thrown out the window because it's completely irrational. So if what I understand about your notion of appropriated by the system, yes, I can see that despotic pattern in the current system by all means. However, that's not at all what we're trying to advocate. Naturally, we want to overcome such things, and that should be pretty explicit in our materials. Okay, and I'm going to go to the final question now from Sam. Open quote question. The Zeitgeist Movement proposes societal orientation based on particular paradigms of logic and science. What gives logic validity? What gives the scientific method validity? Are logic and the scientific method merely presupposed as valid? If validity is derived from physical reference that we perceive, what makes perception of these reference more valid than other perception that, in contrast, is antithetical to the paradigms of logic and science promoted by the Zeitgeist Movement? Unquote, end of question. Great question. In its broad scope, out-of-the-box thought, which I always appreciate. The fact is there's too much causality in the existing environment that cannot go unrecognized. If you can watch a seed be planted and a seedling emerge and then a tree form from that, you're looking at a process, a natural process that has an inherent logic, which by definition of that logic is scientific. Therefore, this type of causality permeates everything. You can't deny this as some type of relativist notion, philosophically relevant relative notion. It's impossible to relegate such a thing to what you could consider arbitrary or just some flaw of perception. It's too validated and too reinforced on multiple levels. For example, the efficacy of the approach is what defines all the technological advancements that we have at our disposal today. If this approach wasn't valid, then the elements around you at the moment, what keeps your house up, the integrity of just about everything you utilize with technology wouldn't work. So while one could argue the accuracy of the way the perspective is philosophically, the vindication of the application is all around you on one level or another. And again, it will continually change and it will continually be updated, but it's very obvious to see how things are connected and the products of those connections based on causality, and hence you have your general basis of basically reality as you know it, hence scientific causality. Again, the terms and definitions and semantics will change. There will always be a mutation of it, but the pattern seems to be so clear and so consistent, and the fruits of it so obvious, I can't find a way to, quote, debunk such a concept as a general worldview and philosophical basis for everyone to think about. Anything else would be considered, quote, irrational by the actual definition of what rationality is, which is inherently based on causality and the recognition of it. And that does it for me for today. I hope that was helpful, and we'll continue this. There's tons more questions that I can't get through, but I will continue to do this, I think, on all the radio shows that follow. It's a good thing to do. It always helps me as well to see where people are. And I will talk to you all very soon, and we'll see who the next host is for next week. So I think it might be time for Sir Ben McLeish to pop in here. So I'll shoot him an email to harass him. Hope everyone's well out there. Talk to you soon.